You're listening to the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on the Old Testament historical books. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders. I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner, who's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day.
And I'm tricked you, Tyler. I'm afraid today I don't have a word for today, but I have a concept. Yeah. And so this is kind of a special session because it's something that when I was reading 1 Kings 1:21 and I realized, we might need to talk about that. So here's what it says.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it will come about when my lord the king sleeps with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon will be considered offenders. So remember the context was Nathan comes into, Nathan and Bathsheba come into David, and David was worried that, or hadn't told who was going to be king next. And so,
right.
Yeah. So when it says, when my lord the king sleeps, he meant when King David dies.
Yeah.
So a few years ago, I did a study on the Israelite concept of afterlife, and it was kind of interesting because I found some stuff that I couldn't hardly believe, and found some stuff I didn't like either. But we'll look at it, and I'll show you what I found.
Yeah.
I started about 2000 BC and tried to find out what did they believe back in like Abraham's time. And I kept seeing phrases like going to be with your fathers or going to sleep with your fathers, like that one we just saw in Kings. And from what I can tell, it means to go to the family tomb. It means when somebody dies, they go to be with their fathers. And literally, I think it meant go to the family tomb where all their fathers were. And for some reason, that was appealing for them. They actually, that was comforting for them. So then I kept going. I went to about 1000 BC. And then I started getting more of the concept of Sheol talked about. So it talked about, I still got some of the passages that talked about going to be with your fathers, but I also, the idea of going to Sheol. And I found out that things like Sheol, it talked about it being downward. Several passages covered that. And a lot of times it was parallel with death. And sometimes it's possible there might even be chambers or levels in Sheol, because Deuteronomy talks about going to the lowest part of Sheol or the lowest level of Sheol. So I don't build too much on that because I'm not sure how clear that is, but I did come across a few of those. But one thing that was actually really interesting is when you get to the Psalms, it talks about both the righteous and the wicked going to Sheol. So both of them are going to the same place. At that point, it didn't clarify it much more than that. So then I went to Daniel. Daniel 12 is a very interesting passage. So why don't you go to Daniel 12 if you've got your Bible? Now, Tyler, tell me a little about Daniel. Do you know the date? Have any idea when it was written?
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking it was kind of like the between 700 and 400 BC, or something like that.
Okay, so is
that about right?
Yeah, it's probably more like 600 or maybe late 500 or in the high 500s.
Okay.
But the idea is that it's very close to when most people understand that the last book of the Bible was written about 400 BC. So that means that towards the end of the biblical text, more revelation was given. At that point, now you finally get something that's a little more clear than what you've been talked about before. So when you look at Daniel 12, verse 2, it says this: many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. So it sounds like we've got people now being resurrected. Now, in the past, there were passages that talked like in Ezekiel. You've got the nation being resurrected. Remember the dry bones vision?
Oh yeah,
where the body comes back together and stuff like that. But that seems to be Israel and Judah being reunited. Okay, so the nation basically being reunited. But individual resurrection is very rare. This one is about the clearest that I've found. There's some passages in Job, but I don't think that they're talking about what we think they are. But this one seems pretty clear. Some are going to everlasting life, some to everlasting contempt. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, that's right before we get to the New Testament. And do you remember the rich man and Lazarus story?
Yeah.
Go to that. It's in Luke 16.
Okay, I'm there.
Can you tell me what you remember about that story?
Well, there's some interesting stuff, right? I mean, rich man, Lazarus, they die, and
Okay.
then they can see each other.
Okay.
And the rich man can see that he's aware that he's in hell, basically. He can
Okay.
see the rich Lazarus in like paradise, and he
Okay.
wants to go. He wants like a drop of water just for some kind of relief.
Yeah.
But he also wants his I think his family, right? He wants his family to know.
Yep.
Not to come here, basically.
So he wants God to send Lazarus back to his brothers. Remember that?
That's right. Send Lazarus back. Yeah.
Okay. Now,
and that's also where we get that line, right? Like some people get good things in life, and some people get bad things in life, and it kind of reverses, right?
Yeah,
Isn't that in there too?
Yep, that is. Okay. All right. Now, there's some other things that, well, first of all, let me ask you a question. If you died today, where would you go?
Well, I'm a Christian, so I'd go to heaven, but I think you probably have a more complicated answer you're trying to get out of me, right?
Well, I'm trying to figure out, do you have some passages that suggest that to you? Or even, can you remember anything?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me think about that for a sec.
I'll give you some help.
Yeah.
Okay. In 2 Corinthians 5:8, do you remember when it says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord? That's Paul talking.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And then in Philippians has another one where Paul says, I'd rather go to be with God.
Sure.
But it's more, it's better if I stay here with you. It's more advantageous for you. So there's two passages that are pretty clear that when somebody dies now, they go to be with God. Yeah. But I actually think that something has significantly changed from Old Testament to New Testament. And Luke 16 is the key that starts helping us unlock that. Remember I told you that about 1000 BC, the righteous and the wicked were both in the same place? Yeah. Yeah, or at least in their minds, they both went to Sheol. What you find out in Luke 16 is that there are two parts of Sheol. One part is called Abraham's bosom. And remember, that's where Lazarus is. Yeah. Okay. And I'm sure that makes a lot of sense because to be in Abraham's bosom, it means when John leaned on Jesus's bosom, it means he was close to him. So my guess is that that's where Abraham is. And so that's why that story talks about that, I think. On the other side, I don't know if you remember, but it actually is not called hell. It's called Hades. Yeah. Remember,
I just saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. In verse 23, it says, and in Hades, he lifted his eyes, being in torment. So my understanding is that that's the other part of Sheol at this point. So there are two parts of Sheol. One is where the righteous people are. The other is where the wicked people are. And remember, one is a place of comfort. One's a place of torment. People like Abraham are in the place of comfort. The rich man is in the other place. And that place is, and remember, then there's that big, great chasm that no one can pass. Remember,
separates them. Right?
Yeah, he makes it real clear they can't pass each other. Yeah. All right. What I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you, I actually believe that when Jesus died on the cross, there was a significant change that happened. Let's look at them. But I first want to talk about what happens to those other people. So, because I need to explain the Hades part. So can you go to Revelation chapter 20?
Okay. Where are we at?
All right. We're at verse 10. And let me just start a little before that. So I'll start at verse 9. And they came up on the broad place of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and the fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and false prophet are also. And there they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. That's part of it. Now go to verse 14. I'm going to start at verse 13. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and the dead the death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and they were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. Did you see that term, Hades? So,
yeah.
and death. So my understanding is that at this time, both death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. So let me just try to clarify a little. My understanding of that, Hades is a place of torment. We got that from Luke 16, but now at the end, it's going to be cast into the lake of fire that burns forever and ever. So that's a permanent thing. My understanding that Hades is a temporary thing. Now, why is death thrown into the lake of fire?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to ask you about, because a part of me would think that it's, if what you're saying is true, that there's like a parallel here, like Hades and then, Hades and Hades, basically. Hades is its reference in Revelation, Hades as we see it in Luke with the rich man Lazarus. Is death corresponding with Abraham's bosom in a way? Like that it just kind of covers in some kind of... You made a noise that made me think that's not right.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, I guess what I was saying was just, because I could see it being some kind of parallel in that it covers everything in a way.
Okay, let me tell you, what is going to happen to death at the end time?
It's destroyed.
Yeah.
There's no more death.
There's no more death, right? So it's actually cast in the lake of fire because it's not needed anymore. So it's pretty much cast into that area, no longer needed. Yeah. My understanding is that Hades is cast into there too. And so the people, I understand it, that are in Hades now will go into that lake of fire. When you think of hell, you probably are technically think of the lake of fire, right?
Sure, right.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the popular image, right?
Yeah. So my understanding is that that's the picture for the final punishment is lake of fire and cast in there. Hades is cast in there. So as I understand it, that means that the place of comfort is still there, but the people that were in Hades are emptied out of there, or just cast right into the lake of fire, probably. Okay,
but the place of comfort would remain.
Well, let's look at that. My understanding is that when Jesus died on the cross, that place got emptied. Right? Because at that, here's my example. When Jesus says to the thief on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise."
Yeah.
I don't think he could have said that before that day, right? Because Jesus hadn't made a way yet. So he's going to die on the cross, make a way so that he can actually then go to be in paradise with him. Some of the passages that talk about Jesus being the way maker that goes before us to open the way into heaven. Now, one of the passages that I never understood that I think relates to this is Matthew 27, verse 52 and 53. Can you go there? So Matthew 27. I'm going to start at verse 46. Okay. So I'm in Matthew 27. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of those who were standing near, when they heard it, began saying, "This man is calling for Elijah." Immediately, one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with sour wine and put on it a reed and gave him a drink. But the rest of them said, "Let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Now, okay, here we go. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. Okay, let me just stop there. My understanding is that's the first sign when Jesus dies on the cross. What's it mean?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that often, that's kind of the separation between God and man. There's a new way to resolve that.
Okay.
It used to have to be done through the temple. Now it's done through Christ.
Okay.
For all people, essentially.
And some of the images that was there is ripping it from top to bottom. What's that suggest?
Well, that it wasn't done from bottom to the top. Like a person didn't do that.
Okay. So it sounds like God did it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And remember, the high priest could only go in there once a year. And even then with blood, Hebrews talks about. My understanding.
All kinds of ritual.
Yeah. My understanding is now the way is open. Jesus has now made a way that he can actually, they can have access into heaven. The reformers talked about this as being individual priesthood of all believers. Remember those phrases?
Sure,
yeah. So my understanding is that now Jesus has made the way so we can go to God. So he's now our high priest that actually takes us to God. So that was the first image. All right, now look at the second one. And this is one I had no idea what it was. All right, verse 52. The tombs were open and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming from the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now, I used to think, okay, I realized I was wrong. But I used to think that what happened when Jesus died on the cross, it was so powerful that it splashed out on others and they came alive. I don't think that makes any sense, but I have a better answer now. I think it's a second sign. These people were raised from the dead to be a sign to the people that were still living, that when they die, and they're believers, they're going to be more alive than ever because they're going to be with God. And now notice they were all saints and they go to Jerusalem so that people can see them. So I think what's going on, this is a second sign so that people know what's going to happen when they die.
Yeah.
Does that make some sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right. So that's kind of in my mind, that's kind of I help to know what's happening on the other side of Sheol, the Sheol part, that place of comfort. So let me just summarize. So we know that one part, when Jesus dies on the cross, those people that were on the Abraham's bosom side get to go up and be with God because the way had now been opened so that they could do that. My understanding is that the people on the other side have to wait until the last days when there will be a judgment. They will then be cast in the lake of fire with Hades and death. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But I've got some questions.
Oh, I bet so.
Are you ready for questions?
I'll tell you what, let me give you a little more information and then let's come for questions.
Okay, that sounds good.
There's another passage that I had no idea what it meant. So can you go to 1 Peter 3:19?
Yeah, do you want me to read it for you?
Yeah, let's start at verse 18.
Maybe.
That's probably good.
For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water.
Okay, let's stop there because I have no idea what the next phrase it means. Remember, it talks about baptism saves you. Yeah. All right. Okay, so at this point, my understanding is, remember, they could actually look, if you go back to the Luke 16 passage, remember the people on the one side could actually see into the other part. They just couldn't get there. So my understanding is that the people in comfort, when they go to be with God, they all take off. My understanding is that the people on the other side were probably looking at that thinking, oh, good, finally we'll get out of this punishment or this torment also. And I think God had to go, or Jesus had to go down to them to tell them, no, you've made your decision already. One of these days you'll be cast in the lake of fire. You don't get out of this. So I think what's happening is that you're getting a passage to help explain what's going on. Now, in that passage, the word is used is euangelion, the good news. And throughout the gospel, sometimes it is used that way. But in 1 Peter, it's never used that way. It's only used to mean a proclamation. So my understanding is that he goes down to Hades. Now, there's some other things that help us know down there what those people are. Notice it talked about them being there like in the days of Noah. See, my understanding, my understanding is that's telling you who he's going to proclaim to. The people in Noah's day had rejected God. And so now he said 8 of them were saved, but the rest of them were punished. So my understanding is it's letting you know who he's going to make that proclamation to. And it's the people in I can probably be more specific now. It's in Hades that are now thinking they might get to go too.
Right.
Okay. Now I'm ready for questions.
Yeah. Okay. So this is pretty complex.
Yeah.
But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's kind of two parallel things happening here.
Okay.
One is that there's actually a change that occurs in the afterlife from, at Christ's death and resurrection.
Yeah.
But also there's a development of thought happening over time too.
Yeah.
Because I could see people arguing that this is all just maybe not too much has changed in actuality, but there's just been growing development of thought over time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like maybe could you unpack a little bit of that for us? Like we have this one trail that's kind of giving us this development of thought and understanding kind of, as people progress, they get more and more revelation, they understand more. And then also that there's a change that happens.
Yeah. I need both of those things, don't I? Because I actually think there is more revelation given and stuff like that. So I do think that kind of thing actually helped them understand that there's something new happening too. But I also think that because Jesus hadn't died on the cross yet. Now I know God has, his time is so much different than ours. So trying to explain that would be impossible. I can't do that. So in their minds, maybe everything happens kind of at once, but we can't have our sins taken care of until Jesus actually dies on the cross. And as far as I know, that was a temporal spot in time that it happened. And so we can't actually have our sins. I guess it's possible that God could look forward and say, I know Jesus is going to die, so I'll let you come. But it doesn't sound like that the biblical text explains it that way, right? It sounds like they have Abraham's bosom in that. And some people said, well, this is a parable, so you can't really build much on a parable. But
you mean Rich Man and Lazarus is a parable?
Yeah. And I would actually say on that, I'm not sure that's true. If it is, it's the only parable that actually has a human name given. Most of them are different than that. Most of the time they say something like,
it's a kind of generic character.
Yeah. So to have
a
something,
vineyard owner and workers, whatever. Yeah,
exactly. Or a sower goes out to sow seed, but this one is very specific, and two people are clearly named. So I think this is more than just a parable.
Well, I think it's even if it is just a parable, it is.
Yeah,
it certainly seems to be based on. I think if you took it at like a completely non-spiritual level, like if you just looked at it just as like a anthropologically or something, like you would still see that there's an implied cosmology happening here, right? There's some kind of thought and understanding of like, this is how this wouldn't just be completely pulled out of thin air. Like there has to be assumptions from the audience, that they understand kind of these concepts as well, right?
Yep, I think you're right. So
I mean, we know it's more than that, but I think even apart from that, you would have to assume something.
Yeah. So I think that's helping us. Yeah. Are there any other questions that you had?
Yeah, I think another question that kind of it ties into this. What's how can a modern Christian kind of take this and eat this and understand this and kind of internalize this?
Yeah.
Because again, it's kind of complicated, and it kind of ties in. I mean, I mean, we went from Genesis to Revelation discussing this concept. So it's a really big concept. It's a kind of a meta narrative or something that kind of goes through the whole Bible almost, this kind of concept of the afterlife. Yeah. It's also something that people are very interested in, and people outside of Christianity, of course, are also very concerned with and interested in.
Yeah.
So like, how do we kind of take this and make it something that like, the average church person can kind of deal with in a way?
Yeah. In my mind, I guess the way I would go, that the application I'd see here is this is actually a really exciting passage because it's actually, and I realize that Luke 16, you read it and it's interesting and all that. But what we didn't realize is that this is like the turning point, opening the door to something God is doing totally new, that when he dies on the cross, this concept is no longer valid. It's no longer needed. It's going to be blown away. And I think some of this, most people in the church understand. Most people understand that when Jesus died on the cross, significant different things happened. And I think what this is this is just a fleshing out of some of the things that did happen that maybe they already knew happened, but didn't understand how these passages fit together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
another issue in that text, rich man and Lazarus. Yeah. I think that's what drives, or one of the texts that drives people towards annihilationism.
It could be. Yeah.
Because there's a question in there of, okay, will the enjoyment of heaven be marred or lessened or something by the knowledge and like not just the knowledge, but being able to see people in hell?
Yeah.
Like, that's a question that would be, I mean, that's an important question to ask, but I think in your conception here, that actually wouldn't be an issue, because this is kind of a middle state that ends.
Yeah. And not only that,
or has ended.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that Sheol today, it only has one kind of people in it, right? The people that were in Hades. So I don't think today they see anything when they look over there, because that side's empty. It sounds like to me.
Right.
Yeah. So and another thing is, notice I have no idea that when people get to heaven, that they'll be able to look down and see what's going on.
Sure.
It doesn't mention that, or it doesn't help explain that part at all. So I really don't know what happens once we get to heaven. Yeah. I have to admit that's a tough concept.
Sure.
And I agree it's a tough one. So I think what it's intended to do is to get us to make sure that we do our job witnessing down here on earth, because at some point there won't be another option, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there will be no more options for them.
Well, I mean, and that's it seems to reflect another kind of common theme we get, especially through the New Testament, all the way through Revelation. Yeah. But before that too, but in the Old Testament as well. But the idea that there's kind of two paths.
Yeah.
There's not really like a middle way or
that's right.
some halfway in between. There's a hard line that's drawn. It's sheep or goats, and
right.
We've been talking with Dr. Stewart about Revelation, so that's kind of where my mind has been. But there's a lot of imagery there about that separation. Mark of the beast, or kind of the mark of God. Like, you're going to have one.
Yeah.
And the rich man and Lazarus certainly kind of leans into that as well.
Yeah. There's one other thing I want to make sure it's real clear. I don't believe that this is like sending somebody to purgatory. Some people could see this as a temporary punishment that they get out of. See, where this is totally different than that.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Is Hades is actually, it's going to be a place of torment, and it's temporary. But those same people go right into the lake of fire, as I understand, because it says Hades will be cast into there. So I don't want people to think that I believe in a purgatory and that punishment will be over. This sounds like it's a permanent thing. And remember, Tyler, we talked about in Isaiah how that last passage about the worm never dies and fire never goes out. That sounds pretty clear that it's not going out, because there'll always be food there. That person is constantly in that torment, in that burning. Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah. All right. Now, that's the big picture. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Any other questions about that big picture?
I don't think so. Maybe we should just kind of tie it back into 1 Kings.
Okay. Hang on.
Where we started from.
Can I do that in a minute? Because I still have two issues. One of them is a very difficult one. Let me talk about the easier one. In Genesis 15:6, it says, "And Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness."
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean?
Okay. Oh, I see where you're getting here.
Yeah, because he at that point he didn't have the revelation that talks about Jesus. He had no idea what was happening in the future. My understanding is that Abraham, because he's believing, he's qualified to go to heaven, but the way hadn't been made yet, so he can't go yet. So when I say he's qualified, that means that at that point he has made the choice to believe God, and therefore God is at some point going to take him to be with him. He can't do it yet because it hadn't been made yet. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
But that is a big problem, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an issue that I'm sure people are wondering about. And I thought, well, we better talk about that because remember, it says that he was in Abraham's bosom. So that makes it pretty clear that's where Abraham went. And why did he go there? Well, because he'd already been qualified to go to heaven, but the way just hadn't been made yet. Yeah. Okay. That's one.
Yeah.
There's two more. And this one is, I don't like, but I don't have a better answer for this one, is people want to know where children go when they die. And generally they take them to 2 Samuel. Go to 2 Samuel 12, verse 23. And here's where it's tying back into Samuel anyway. Okay, hang on. This is that passage where David is, it's Bathsheba and his son that because of his sin, God was going to punish him and he was going to die. Let me just read. I'll start at verse 20 to give them the context, okay? So David rose from the ground, washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes, and he came into the house of the Lord and worshipped. And he came to his own house, and then he set food before him and ate. And the servant said, "What is this thing that you have done? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But when the child died, you rose and ate food." And he said, "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me, and the child may live. But now he has died, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." See, and most people argue this way. Well, David is a righteous person, and therefore he is, obviously when he dies, he's going to heaven. So that means that when the child dies, he's going to heaven too. There's a problem with that. Look at the context that we're in. Remember, at about 1000 BC, they think the righteous and the wicked go to the same place. Yeah. So I don't think this passage is telling us where children go when they die. I think all it's saying is they both go to Sheol in David's mind, and it's not clear. Now, there's New Testament passages that talk about, there's passages that talk about unless you become like one of these, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven, or suffer the children to come to me, for such is the kingdom of heaven, those kind of passages. So you'd think that because children, have not tested their wickedness, that maybe they'll go to heaven. On the other side of that, we also know they have a sin nature. And because of that sin nature, that's enough to send them to hell already. So I think it's a complicated thing, and I don't know the exact answer to that one. So what I do say is that I trust God who knows where they go. That you might think that's a punt, and that's not a real good answer, especially if you've got a grieving parent, but it's the best that I got, because scripture seems to be unclear in this area. So I think it's better to be unclear than to try to give them false hopes.
Well, and I think this affects both of these two issues we just talked about that are kind of complications, but we always have to be careful not to accidentally or maybe purposely create some kind of alternative path towards reconciliation outside of Christ. And that's very complicated, of course, with children, especially related to death, but it's also complicated. It's less maybe personally complicated, but it is complicated when we think about some of our Old Testament figures, who are around before Christ.
Right. You just opened up something that I want to talk one more thing about. And these I call enigmas. These are things like Enoch. Remember, it says that Enoch was not, for God took him. He walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him in Genesis 5. Then in what you got in the other one is Elijah. Well, I mean, the Enoch passage makes it sound like God wanted him so much to be with him that God takes him to be up with him. And Elijah also goes up in a whirlwind, and it makes it makes it look like he goes up and goes to be with God. Now, I admit those are possible, but that would seem like, to me, that's not the normal thing Scripture talks about. These guys could be exceptions. I don't like that, but I think there's a better reason for these enigmas. My understanding is for Enoch, he goes up, he walks with God, he goes up, but then he comes right back to Sheol. Same with Elijah. He goes up in this whirlwind, then comes right back down to Sheol. The good part of Sheol, I'm convinced, but still back to Sheol. Because if not, then that's another way of salvation besides. See, you're the one that brought this up, and I'm going, you're right. So I'm going to argue that these enigmas are there for a reason. And I think the reason is, it's like, I don't know if you remember, but in Job, I think it's chapter 9. It says he wishes that he had. In mine has an arbiter. I think one of my translations had umpire, and I don't think that's a good translation. But he was longing to have a go between him and God, and because he was trying to tell God he hadn't sinned, but but obviously it looked like he was being punished. So he wished he had an arbitrator to do that. My understanding that in time, God does give him an arbitrator. That arbitrator is Jesus. But he would have never wanted an arbitrator until he got in that situation where he actually needed one. And so I think what happens is that God puts enigmas in the Old Testament to get us longing for more. And then sometimes he actually gives us those things, like with Jesus, the arbitrator for Job. And I think enigmas for these two, Elijah and Elisha, because he's thinking, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could go to be with God? Now, I know that's not possible, but wouldn't that be neat when we die? And I think that those are there to get us longing for that.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's my guess anyway.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think?
I think, man, wow, there's a lot to this.
Yeah.
But it's very helpful. And I think it's a helpful reminder for a couple of different reasons. One, it's helpful to remember that there is a development of thought as we go through kind of history in the Bible. And then I think it's also, I don't think it's an accident that this is in talking about death, and when people are confronted with death, that a lot of in our day-to-day life, we're surrounded by death, and we all know people who are either they have family members who are passing away, or they're maybe they're on their way. So I think it's no accident that this is a way that we also end up talking about the gospel.
Yeah.
And we end up talking about, just like we said, like there's, one way. Yeah. There's one way of salvation. And that this is so like it's heavy. It's a lot to think about, and it's complicated. And there's a lot of words, that we're not as used to, describing these different places, and it can be kind of confusing, but I think it's necessary because death is a fact of life, and everyone has questions about it.
Yeah.
And, we're blessed that we have an answer.
Yeah. What I wanted to make sure is I just took you through almost all the most difficult passages and at least have an answer for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when I did this research, it actually opened up so many passages that I had no idea what they were talking about, and finally made sense to me. And I thought, wow, this is a concept we need people to know. Yeah. So it goes.
Well,
Go on.
That's one of those things. One of the things that I look for whenever I'm reading the Bible, just personally, or even just listening when someone's preaching or whatever. When I come across a section of scripture, I try to look for things that don't make sense to me. Like, I think I used to read it and I just kind of would ignore things that didn't make sense. I would just kind of go past it. And I try to really hone in on those things now, because what I've found is usually that's where nuggets are. That's where the good is. It's there's I need to think about it a little bit longer. I need to read it slower. I need to think about it in not just in its immediate context, but in the kind of grand narrative of the Bible, and put these things together, because that little thing that doesn't quite make sense to me, there's a reason it doesn't quite make sense. I haven't connected all the details correctly, something like that. But there's a lot of meaning to be had there. And just like you're saying, like this, there's a lot of challenging passages, even if you're not thinking about it in this kind of way. When you come to a lot of these passages, it's a little complicated that, like what you in 1 Peter 3:19, that's a tricky passage is if you're just reading 1 Peter 3.
Right.
But there's a lot to be gained by digging through these tough passages.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I have to admit, it sparked me, my interest when it said, we were in 2 Kings and it said, when you die or when you go to be with your fathers, and I'm going, wait, that's not usually how we understand that. So what's he actually meaning by that? And that's when I started examining it a little further. So,
It's really good. Well, I think this is a great excursion as we're kind of for the section of the Old Testament we're going through right now. Don't be afraid to take us on more of these as we go through. We started off, this whole podcast talking about Isaiah, and then we were going to talk about just complicated topics, and that ended up really just being like we're just going to walk through Genesis, and now we're just going through the Bible, kind of straight through the Old Testament. But I think as these kind of topics come up, we should take a moment and stop and go through it.
Sounds good. I will do that.
Yeah. All right. That sounds good to me.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. We'll be looking forward to the next one.
All right. Thanks, Tyler.